como el Thrifty Food Plan Framework. Y el doctor Park Wild es profesor de la Escuela Friedman de Ciencias y Políticas de la Nutrición en la Universidad de Tufts. Entonces, pues, el doctor Mario Flores y yo estamos muy contentos porque es de la universidad donde nosotros obtuvimos el doctorado. Entonces, pues, nos da un gusto especial tener a alguien de nuestra escuela de posgrado. Y el doctor Wild realizó sus estudios doctorales en la Universidad de Cornell y trabajó para el Departamento de Agricultura de Estados Unidos en los servicios de investigación económica. Ahorita está en Tufts, donde imparte clases de estadística y de políticas alimentarias. Y su investigación aborda la economía de las políticas alimentarias y nutrición en Estados Unidos, diseño dirigido a evaluación del componente de incentivos saludables del programa suplementario de asistencia nutricional en el condado de Hampden, en Massachusetts, y es miembro del Foro de Alimentos del Instituto de Medicina de los Estados Unidos y del Comité Científico y Tecnológico de Menús de Cambio, una iniciativa para promover la salud y la sostenibilidad de la industria de restaurantes. Vino a México a dar unas conferencias y estamos aprovechando para tenerlo aquí. Si tienen preguntas, me pidió el doctor Park que deje un tiempo para que pueda haber un diálogo con ustedes, entonces pues aprovechen las preguntas que se les ocurren, anótenlas y podemos discutir al final de su presentación. La otra cosa es que el doctor Park Wild vino aquí hace 35 años a Cuernavaca a aprender español, entonces entiende un poco de español. Si alguien no habla inglés, pero quiere hacer su pregunta en español, él nos dice que por favor la hagan y que él la va a entender, y si no, pues aquí ayudamos entre todos. Entonces, Park, bienvenido, muchas gracias.
Gracias. Muchas gracias, doctor Simón. Estoy muy alegre de estar aquí y voy a hablar en inglés para la presentación, pero durante el tiempo de preguntas podemos hablar en cualquier idioma y si no comprendo algo, ellos me van a ayudar. It's a real pleasure to be here. What I'd like to do is talk about two topics, including about household food security measurement in the United States, and also about how to think together about the cost of healthy food, which requires thinking simultaneously about what is the cost, what is the meaning of healthy, and what are people's preferences, so that you get model diets that match what anybody would actually in the real world want to consume, and not just what a nutritionist would love, as fine as that is. And the presentation is going to cover material from two studies, both of which had USDA support. One of these is a reflection that Tufts University helped USDA with, looking backwards on the 25 years of survey-based household food security measurement. As you know, for a long time, people studied how much food insecurity and hunger there is using anthropometric measures like stunting and wasting, and using economic measures like poverty. But for 25 years, we've had a nice survey-based instrument, and this gave us a chance to look back on where we had come and where we should be going in the next period with that. The second study is a current study for USDA's NIFA, the Institute for Food and Agriculture Research. And that study is looking using the same type of models that are used for the Thrifty Food Plan, which is a model diet connected with the SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program in the United States, the major anti-hunger program. Anything that I say should not be attributed neither to my bosses nor to USDA. So in addition to the two topics, there's some themes that you'll see in both parts of the presentation. One is that we need to both pay attention to what consumers aspire to and what constraints keep them from achieving their aspirations. Second is we need to draw on the disciplines of both economics and nutrition. And you can see how you're in a very special place here at this institute because of the combination of disciplines that you've brought together. And third is that we need to think both about quantitative research methods, rigorous methods, but also how are they translated into actual use for policy purposes. And fourth, we need to build on the strengths of what has been done over many years, this sort of very strong sense of accomplishment in research over a number of years, but we have to be open to new approaches also, not to think that just because things are the way they've been done before, that's the way they should always be done. So first, let's talk about household food security measurement. When I worked at USDA, this report came out, and during the early years, there was such a strong sense of public interest, purpose, and hope in the United States for improvement in food security. Countries around the world at the time adopted solemn declarations to cut their rates of food insecurity by half. And so for the United States, that would have meant that this survey-based measure of how many people are food insecure would drop from about 12% of the population to about 6%. And you can see that in the first years, it looked like they were making progress. Since then, everything has gone wrong. Progress has stalled in the United States. It's a source of embarrassment. And I'm the only person who remembers this slide because I make myself a little bit of a nuisance to people by reminding them that we once had hopes for these stronger drops in household food insecurity. Here's what actually happened over those years. There's the early drops from the late 1990s to the early 2000s. And then during the mid 2000s, there was economic expansion, but it was not a successful economic expansion for those in the United States who had least income. And then came the Great Recession, and food insecurity rates increased. And only now we've had success in bringing it back down from the peak, but we've made no progress towards our original hopes for big reductions in household food security. Let me do a digression and talk about how is household food security related to nutrition? Because of course, the more food that people need, what is your definition of adequate is going to be closely connected to what percent of people do you find below a threshold of adequacy. And so later, I'll be talking about the Thrifty Food Plan, which requires thinking about what amount of calories do people in different demographic groups need. And if these numbers were different, then people would need more or less food. For example, if you were eating healthy, you might not need so many calories, or if you're getting more physical activity, you might need more calories. I did this project on the 25 years reflection in partnership with Irma Arteaga from the University of Missouri. And we gave small grants to people around the country in the United States, researchers, and all of those are collected in a special issue of the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, which will be coming out shortly. So here is the actual food security questions. I'll talk about scaling methods a little later in the talk, but the heart of the empirical evidence that comes from household food security measures is in response frequencies to the questions themselves. And so here we have 10 adult reference items. So these are 10 items that are asked of all members, all households in the United States in major national surveys, such as the Current Population Survey. And you can see what percent of people say that they experienced this or that hardship, such as, did we worry that we would run out of food? Or did the food that we have not last through the whole month, for example? 14% or 11% say that they had this experience. And when you look at the survey-based methods that USDA uses in the United States and that many countries have adopted versions of, you can see a number of difficult choices. For example, what types of hardship should these surveys be measuring? Should they be focused specifically on food, or should they be broader poverty-related hardships? Second is, how do you count up the number of affirmative responses? The easiest way to do it is to use something called the raw score. For the raw score, you just add up how many of the questions had a yes answer, and that number from 0 to 10 of these adult referenced items, that shows how severe is household food insecurity in that family. You could do more complicated scaling models using a field of statistics called item response theory that I'll talk about a little more in a minute. You face difficult choices about what reference period should you use. If you say, did you have this problem in the past 12 months? There's going to be more people who say yes than if you say a shorter time period, such as just in the past 30 days. But in the past 30 days, it's more closely matched to the program cycle for nutrition assistance programs. So if you want to evaluate the SNAP program in the United States, the Major Anti-Hunger Program, or the WIC program, using this type of household food security measure, then really a 30-day measure might be more what you would want because people enter and exit the program. Finally, there's strengths and weaknesses to having a single national survey instrument or having some variations for particular populations and particular cultural settings that might use different language or have different experiences of hardship. So I won't spend too much time on the technical details, but let's talk about the Roche model. For those of you studying in graduate school in nutrition sciences or in economics, this is in the family of logit models or logistic regression models. For all models in the logit family, you're looking at how do explanatory factors, explanatory variables, increase the log odds that a particular outcome happens. In this case, we want to know about what factors affect the log odds that people say yes to a particular food security item T. So if T is the third or the fifth food security item, this tells you what affects the probability that people say yes to a particular item. And the two things the model pays attention to are how food insecure is the household. So this is a scale score where a bigger number means you're in more hardship, a smaller number means you're in less hardship. But the second thing is how severe is that particular item? So beta T tells you if one question is about, did you just worry? Maybe a lot of people worry, but another question is, did you go a whole day without food? And maybe only a few people go a whole day without food. And so the current method used by USDA focuses on estimating this household food insecurity score. It's reasonably simple in a simple model like the Roche model, but I will talk in a little bit about how things could get more complicated, perhaps even unduly complicated, if you start to take into consideration greater complexity in what's going on in the lives of people who are responding to the survey. So the Roche model has several implications. One is that the raw score is all you need to determine the food security score. So that little phi, you can estimate it if all you know is how many items did they say yes to. If they said 5 items yes or 8 items yes, you can tell how food insecure they are. The second thing is that other factors such as income or whether you're in a food desert or whether you had an aunt who had to go to the hospital and you had to help pay her medical bills and that caused hardship for your family. All of those other things can affect how much hardship does your family have, but it can only affect it by affecting the food security score, not through other things that affect one question differently from another question. And that's called, in this third bullet, DIF is differential item response. So the Roche model has an assumption that the questions do not respond differently for people in different household circumstances. So when we actually look at empirical evidence, we find that those assumptions don't do very well. And this puts us in a tough spot. If you were USDA trying to decide what survey methods to use, what analysis methods to use, you would have some of these hard choices. You could use more complex models. So some of the more complex models, one of them is called the 2-parameter logistic model. It's a little more complex than the one I showed. Another one allows food insecurity factors to be influenced differently for the different items for different households. That allows DIF, this differential item response. Or another thing is you could use more complicated versions of the questions. Instead of just asking, did you worry? Or did you not worry? Or did you worry? Instead of being binary, It could be about how often did you worry? Was it sometimes did you worry? Often did you worry? All the time did you worry? Never. You can have statistical models that use more of that subtlety in the original survey questions. The problem is, in those more complicated models, you need a more complicated statistical analysis in order to estimate how food insecure is a particular household. And my own opinion is that those models become too complicated to explain to policymakers. Earlier, I showed the Roche model, and some of you were probably saying to yourself, that's already complicated. My claim is that the Roche model is not too complicated. I can explain the Roche model, but some of these more complicated models, I despair of being able to really explain it for policy use. And so the policymakers would just have to trust the researcher. And I prefer not to have policymakers trust the researcher. I prefer to make the research an open book and show all of the evidence. And so my own opinion is to keep it simple and keep the focus on the individual food security items. So let's talk about these individual items. I think I'm the only person who reads. I'm not the only person, but not many people spend their time poring over the response frequencies to the individual items, because most people focus on the food security score. But because I have a slight distrust of the food security scores models, I prefer just to look at these simple response frequencies. And so let's think about some of the assumptions for the Roche model. Notice that, for example, did the respondent lose weight? For households with children, 2.1% said that they lost weight because of being hungry. It's not all that much. In the United States, there's more problem with overweight than with underweight, so it's not surprising. The same in households with children, 2.1%. But if you look at worried, for households without children, about 11.9 or 12% worried that they would not have enough food. But 20% of households with children worried that they would not have enough food. This goes with my own experience. As soon as I became a parent, which is now 20 years ago, as soon as I became a parent, I started to worry all the time. And so it's not surprising to me that different people respond to the different questions. This is against the rules for the Roche model. So once you see a pattern like this, it means the Roche model is not really the right model for these statistics. And that's why we have this hard choice about what model do we want to use. Let me tell you about some of the researchers who participated in our small grants program that Irma Arteaga and I organized. And so one of the studies was focusing on Latino and Latina families in particular, in the United States, and seeing through cognitive interviews whether different types of households interpret the questions differently, including because of language differences, but also differences in cultural traditions. So I thought for this audience, you could see how interesting that would be. One of the studies was by David Rebar and Rodrigo Aranda from Georgia State University, and they looked at not just what was the household level conditions, but what was each individual's response in the household. So you could see sometimes one member of the household might do better than another if there's intra-household differences in resource allocation. Here's another, Chelsea Singleton at Tulane University, focused on structural violence and racial justice issues that are at stake in understanding the pathology of food insecurity in the United States. Ana Poblacion, who's at the Boston University School of Medicine, focused on a short version of the food security instrument that's suitable for clinical use. So for those of you who are medical doctors, and you could imagine what type of instrument would be suitable in a clinical setting, you probably don't want to ask 10 or 18 questions. You need a shorter instrument, and having a shorter instrument would be useful to you in including food security among the issues you pay attention to, along with blood pressure and eating patterns. You can see how food security might be actually quite important. All right, so let me tell you about the second of these two studies. So this is thinking about the cost of healthy food. And I should say that the models that we use are not exactly the same. We imitated the Thrifty Food Plan, the USDA model, but everything that I present, be aware that our models might be just a little different from the Thrifty Food Plan, and so it should not be attributed to USDA. I worked with colleagues at Penn State University, including Lin Fan, my own colleagues at Tufts, including Sarah Folta, and Norbert Wilson, who was at Tufts University, but we lost him to Duke University, which gave him a very good job. And it's a tragedy. And but other people on the research team include Angelica Valdez Valderrama, who's from Puerto Rico, and is studying especially cultural differences in how people interpret cost of healthy food in the United States. And so I think even it came up even in conversation with Dr. Michelle over food yesterday evening. There's optimists and pessimists about whether healthy food costs too much. You've probably noticed this. And the pessimist point of view is that if you look at the foods on the horizontal axis that are to the right, more expensive, those are the foods that are more healthy. And if you look to the left at the foods that are more affordable, unfortunately, those are the foods that are less healthy, more, recommended for more occasional use. But the optimist sort of notices foods in all four quadrants, right? There's actually, if you keep an eye out, we even noticed this on our drive to campus. If you keep an eye out, driving up this morning, up Avenida de la Universidad, you see every combination of expensive and inexpensive, healthy and unhealthy. All four quadrants are represented. And I think this is typical in the United States also. So what I would describe as the pessimist point of view, I should say this with no disparagement, because this is a slide from the wonderful researcher, Adam Dranowski, who's a terrific researcher on the economics of the cost of healthy food. If you look on the horizontal axis at the foods that are more expensive, to the right, those are the foods with lower caloric density, so they might be less obesogenic. And if you imagine that your budget constraints pushed you to the left of the figure, then it might be pushing you towards inexpensive, high calorie density foods like heavy in fats and maybe fried potatoes and expensive high density foods at the top left of the figure, where you see oil, for example. In our own work, using the same data that USDA uses for the Thrifty Food Plan, we can imitate this pattern. So you see, these are with 100, this is only 60 of the food groups, but we had data on 120 food categories in the US marketplace. And you can see that it's true that there's a lot of these foods that are more expensive that have the lower calorie density. It's usually because they have a lot of either fiber or a lot of water content, moisture content, like fruits, fresh fruits and vegetables, for example. But things get more complicated when you look at the individual items. In that lower right-hand corner, it includes steak, for example, but that's not what we really typically think of, like fruits and vegetables as something that you're recommending. So steak is expensive. And if you look at the healthier foods that are less expensive, that are more calorie dense, that includes, for example, nuts and seeds. But nuts and seeds are recommended, right? Because of the particular fat profile and because of being part of a nice, diverse, healthy diet. And so things are a little complicated. Things also change depending on what your definition of healthy is. A theme for this talk is that different ways of defining healthy lead to different ways of estimating what is the cost of a healthy diet. That makes sense. And so I'm interested not just in calorie density, which is a measure useful for understanding weight status in particular, but that's not the only healthy nutrition issue. how much fruit and vegetable content can you afford? So here we have the same horizontal axis. How much does it cost with more expensive food to the right? And we have on the vertical axis for each of the food categories, how many 100 grams units of fruit does that food category distribute? You know, for something like a banana, it's all fruit. But for mixed foods, it's important to know how much fruit does it have in it. And you could see that there's no simple upward or downward pattern. This looks to me like just a cloud. It's not got a particular pattern. Look, for example, at berries. Berries are an expensive way to get fruits. But look at bananas. Bananas are an inexpensive way to get fruits. And they both deliver the same amount of fruit. And so you can see that if your goal for healthy diets is to encourage more fruits and vegetables, look at the traditional, think about sodium. So we're supposed to have less sodium. So this graph has sodium on the vertical axis. On the horizontal axis is the same measure of expense. Salad dressing, high sodium, right? And inexpensive. So you think this goes with the idea that inexpensive food is unhealthy. But is salad dressing unhealthy? Think about it. Salad dressing very clearly goes with salad, right? I mean, people don't drink salad dressing. They eat salad dressing on salad. The whole point is that in order to understand what is the cost of a healthy diet, you need to think about the bundle of foods, not the characteristics of the foods just one by one. So thinking about the bundle of foods, I'm presenting research, you know, in a nice, good research institution, but all of these issues also can be communicated with people in the field. I think about the Cooking Matters nutrition education designed without requiring heavy literacy requirements for people in the United States. And you could see that they have a nice presentation style that takes account of all of these issues together. What is the cost of the ingredients? What is the nutrition facts? How long does it take to cook? Because time is an important issue, but also how appealing is it? By using photographs, it sort of tells you something about what is the appeal for, how much would people like it? Would they actually like to eat this? And this brings us to the Thrifty Food Plan, because the Thrifty Food Plan is not necessarily perfect, but as an economist who works on nutrition issues, I really like it a lot because it thinks about the things that we need to think about. It thinks about cost, the definition of healthy eating, and how appealing or palatable or desirable is a food bundle. And it does so in a way that's a little bit related to economics models. For those of you who are economists, God bless you. For those of you who are economists, you've probably studied constrained optimization models like maximizing utility subject to a budget constraint. The Thrifty Food Plan is a little bit like that, but it's very familiar to people in the nutrition sciences. These constrained optimization models have a long tradition in nutrition science, in the sort of social science half of nutrition science. And so it's got this cross-cultural interdisciplinary appeal. It serves as a venue for communicating a fairly complicated topic to people from multiple disciplines. Okay, so how does the optimization, I'm going to go through this slide a little more detail. You have these foods, for example, 120 food categories, and your goal is to develop a model diet, which is a list of how much should people consume daily from each of those 120 categories in a model diet. And then our goal is to figure out how much does that model diet cost? And that cost is what the SNAP benefit ought to be, because people need that. If you have a social safety net benefit, that's how much people need to be able to afford in groceries. And so you want to choose a diet that's similar to current intake. Why? Because you don't want to tell people to eat something that's different from their own tradition. You want to tell them, eat something close to what you're accustomed to. but it can't be exactly what you're accustomed to, because what you're accustomed to is too expensive and it's not healthy enough. And so you have to differ enough. You have to differ just enough from current consumption in order to be able to meet a cost constraint, a food energy constraint. You need the right amount of calories, the right amount of food energy, and it should have good nutrient constraints, like it should have sufficient calcium, sufficient iron, not too much saturated fat, not too much sodium, enough whole grains. It should have these nutrient constraints. And this is the complicated part. It should have food group constraints, because they find in the United States, and I think around the world, that just meeting nutrient constraints is fairly inexpensive, but it's not necessarily a diet that many people would agree is adequate. And so now you face the hard choices about, what does adequacy really mean to you? In order to have an adequate diet, do you just need enough protein? Or do you actually have to have enough meat? Does it have to come from meat to be considered adequate? Do you just need enough calcium? Or does it actually have to be dairy to be considered adequate to you? And so the food group constraints are like the meat and the dairy, whereas the nutrient constraints are just like protein and calcium. And so let's think about what it means to have this optimization, because the optimization has this purpose of paying attention to people's desires and paying attention to the nutrition quality and the cost. But in practice, as I'll explain in a minute, I think the model does not pay much attention to people's desires in the end. And here's how that happened. Imagine that this is what people are consuming for meat and bread. This is the current consumption. So the goal of the model is to be as close to current consumption as you can while still meeting cost constraints. So closer to current consumption is sort of better, more appealing to people. But you can't just pick current consumption, because you have to have a cost constraint. So here's the cost constraint, familiar to economists. Down and to the left of the green line is what somebody can afford. So then, though, there's not just a cost constraint, there's also a protein constraint and a not too much saturated fat constraint. Not too much sodium, but enough iron, right? And so there's more and more constraints until you get a smaller and smaller little green triangle. And if you have a very small green triangle, it's as if you weren't really paying attention to their preferences anyway. If I pick a small green triangle somewhere in this space and I say, pick the point in the green triangle that's closest to the blue dot, you have no choice but to pick, it's the same point, no matter what people's preferences are. And when we did an analysis using these thrifty food plan type models, this is what we found, is that it didn't matter much what current consumption bundle you used in the model. For example, usually you try to minimize the distance from current consumption for low-income consumers. But we imagine, what if low-income consumers don't actually like the typical diet for low-income consumers? What if they really aspire to the diet for middle-income consumers or for high-income consumers? What if they have an aspiration that they wish for that they just can't afford? And it made no difference in the model solution. The model solution is so tightly constrained in a little green triangle that it didn't make much difference what preferences you included. So the model makes less use of people's preferences than it appears on first glance. That's my account to you. I'll show you how this works. What we did was we didn't just use one cost target. We varied penny by penny how much the cost constraint could be. We just tried out very low diets to see if there was low cost diets to see if there was a solution. And then we tried out more expensive diets to see if there was a solution. And first, on the horizontal axis, you see what is the daily cost for a person. On the vertical axis, you see how different is the diet from current consumption. And if you look horizontally to the right, you can see the impact of different definitions of adequacy. At the far left, in green, you just have the cost constraint and the calorie constraint. And of course, it's very inexpensive to get enough food. If all you need is food energy, it's not very expensive to get enough food. The middle one is energy, cost, and nutrients. Make sure you get enough calcium, enough iron, and so forth. It's in the middle for how expensive it is. But once you start to add the food group constraints, like having enough beef and enough pork and so forth, then you start to get more expensive diets. And that's the rightmost of these constraints. And the vertical black line is the estimate of what the maximum SNAP benefit is. So imagine that you were trying to afford enough groceries using the budget from the maximum SNAP benefit. You can see that there exists a feasible solution near the top, where the two lines cross, where the black line is crossed by the yellow line. I shouldn't say yellow, I should say red, where the black line is crossed by the red line. There is a solution. You can afford a healthy diet, but it's a diet that's very different from current consumption. So this goes with my theory that the model is paying less attention. It's less deferential, takes less account of people's preferences than you might think. As I said, my presentation is not official Thrifty Food Plan, but the Thrifty Food Plan was revised in 2021, and it had a major impact. This was a major event in US nutrition policy because for many decades, every time USDA revises the Thrifty Food Plan, they use the same cost target that they used previously, but only updated for inflation. But in the fall of 2021, maybe August 2021, researchers deep in the bureaucracy of the USDA concluded that there was no feasible solution using the previous cost target. And so they, without any instructions from the Congress, they said, we need a higher food budget. And they went up penny by penny until they found a feasible solution using this Thrifty Food Plan. And it led to a 21% increase in the maximum SNAP benefit. So this had a big multi-billion-dollar effect on the US social safety net, even during a time when the Congress is fairly conservative. It's fairly, doesn't want to increase the budget for social safety net programs. And so this edition, this 2021 edition of the Thrifty Food Plan paid more attention to nutrition security, used a wider income range from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, and made several other smaller changes, made adjustments to how sodium is taken account of. Sodium is especially difficult because in the highly processed food environment, it's difficult to find foods with low enough sodium levels. And it raised the cost limit. This last one is the politically most influential decision that they made in this 2021 report. Here on the horizontal axis, you see how much do the assumptions for how much do different demographic groups have to be able to afford in dollars per 1,000 calories. And on the vertical axis, you see how much do they actually spend in dollars per 1,000 calories. And if everybody spent exactly what was assumed, we would be right on the red line. But as you can see, in practice, even in low-income communities in the United States, most people have to spend more on food than is assumed. And in particular, if you look at for example, females 20 to 50, it's up in the middle. Females F 20 to 50. It's moderately above the red line. But if you look at males 20 to 50, because men have a higher caloric need higher caloric expenditure anyway, on average, it's a greater difference. And so when USDA increased the benefit, they had to increase it especially. They had to increase the estimate in the Thrifty Food Plan, especially for some demographic groups. So on average, it was a 21% increase in the maximum SNAP benefit. But that was based on a Thrifty Food Plan increase that was different for these different age and gender groups. So to wrap up, here's some of the lessons for optimization models. And this is just my summary. This is not an official summary. Nutrition constraints are easier to meet than food group constraints. And so we have to be thoughtful about what's our justification for imposing food group constraints. The second is that the costs rise with constraints for fruits, vegetables, and protein, just like the pessimists think. You know, the pessimists think healthy food costs too much. So if your definition of healthy is that you need more fruit, vegetables, and protein, you can see how it is true that healthy food costs more. But for sodium and added sugar, it's really not the case that healthy food costs more. You can get inexpensive sources of food that don't have too much sodium and that don't have too much added sugar. And so clearly something else is going on that has to do with preferences. And compared to previous editions, a feasible solution requires higher costs, lower prices, or easier constraints. Something has to give, right? That the way we looked at things previously, the Thrifty Food Plan did not appear to be an adequate cost. And finally, if the solution is barely feasible, just barely feasible, what's really happening is that the model solution is driven by constraints rather than by preferences. And so if you care, I kind of care about people's preferences. If you care about people's preferences, we might need to do something a little differently in this type of modeling than we've currently been doing. So the final conclusions are my own opinionated. And if anybody disagrees, I won't take it badly. This is not exactly something that you can prove with evidence, but it's just my reflection after working in this area for a while, is that for the food security part of this talk, food security survey questions offer excellent insight into the hardship that people experience, but our modeling approach should remain simple. And second, from the Thrifty Food Plan part of this talk, models of healthy food costs should continue, as they already do, to address cost, nutrient and food group requirements, and preferences. Healthy food may appear more affordable and more preferred if we avoid imposing unnecessarily strict food group requirements. And that's just offered for your consideration. So I look forward to your questions. Thanks for your time. That's it.
Thanks a lot, Park. It was an amazing talk, and I think we'll have time for questions. And no sé si tengan preguntas. Yo creo que fue una excelente perspectiva de la complejidad que tiene identificar en seguridad alimentaria los productos y digamos, esta parte de si comer sano es más caro o no, la parte de las elecciones que puede hacer la gente contra lo que deben de comer. Y yo creo que pues ahí hay combinaciones de disciplinas pues muy buenas como en salud pública, la promoción de la salud, ¿no? O sea, esas preferencias a veces no son las más saludables. Nosotros hemos visto aquí en estudios que de repente de las elecciones que hay una gran proporción de calorías que son de refrescos y comida chatarra, y yo creo que ahí lo que han visto estudios y ahorita algunos investigadoras comentarán es que pues esa es una parte muy grande del presupuesto que si se recorta y se reemplaza, puede que no aumente tanto el gasto y sí mejore mucho la dieta, aunque pues sigue estando el reto de las preferencias, ¿no? De si eso es lo que la gente quiere. Entonces, bueno, yo creo que muy interesante. Y pues aquí tenemos investigadoras e investigadores que han trabajado en seguridad alimentaria, en costo de una dieta saludable, y etcétera. Entonces, no sé si quieran hacer alguna pregunta o comentario a Park. Sí, adelante, Juan Carlos. Si quieres, te pasamos un micrófono. Para que también hay en redes un grupo de investigadores escuchando, entonces, para que escuchen todos.
Hola, 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 hola.
Y si dices quién eres y todo.
Well, hi, my name is Juan Carlos. My background is in economics, so I have some questions related to the optimization process and mainly working on things related to the warning labels and taxes here in Mexico. My first question related to the optimization process, it is how did you account for people's preferences? So it was like you have something related to how people value sodium, how people value, sugar. How was the way in which you do it? That's my first question. My second question is this other constraint related to time, because in contrast to ready-to-eat food, when you have, sometimes when you want to eat healthy food, you need to spend time cooking. So if there is something related to that. And finally, this is only a suggestion for another constraint. So, and probably it's pretty difficult because it's kind of endogenous. So there is a paper in which is related to taxes and in which it is welfare and that stuff. And the idea related to taxes and welfare, it is like you don't want to pay for things that are more expensive because you value money. So you don't want to allocate money to things that are more expensive. However, if let's suppose like there is a reduction in your consumption of sugar sweetened beverages, there is going to be a reduction in your body weight. And some people are going to value that as an increase in welfare. So it's possible to have a constraint related to that, like the healthier the food is, the lower your BMI is going to be, and probably some people are going to have some preference related to that. Thank you.
Gracias. Perdón, en cabina, a ver si nos pueden bajar el volumen de los micrófonos porque hay retroalimentación. Gracias.
I will share. Don't you think that'll make it better? There we go. Perfecto. What a great set of questions. Okay, so for the first one, I hope my answer is not a disappointment because the way the objective function is used in that model is a little simpler, but it's not terrible. It's just a little simpler than thinking differently about people's preferences for sodium and their preferences for whole grains. What it does is it just minimizes the distance from their current consumption bundle. And that would work as a utility function. For the economists in the room, it counts as a flavor of quadratic utility function where the bliss point happens to be current consumption. This is a little bit eccentric as a utility function because there's a certain circularity to it. How do people choose what to eat? Well, they maximize their utility subject to a budget constraint. What is their utility? Their utility is to be as close as possible to what people eat on average. What do people eat on average? Oh, that maximizes their utility. So it's a little bit circular. So it's not exactly a utility function that economists necessarily would have preferred, but I still like it in this interdisciplinary spirit of getting nutritionists and economists to talk to each other is already a good challenge. And so the second one was how do you take account of time constraints? And I don't explicitly in this study, but I think there's an idea that people with time constraints might have to eat less healthy food. That you need more ultra processed foods or more ready to eat foods if you have time constraints. It's complicated because there's some easy to prepare foods that are both healthful and inexpensive. But there's also differences even in low-income communities in people's time constraints. If you are a low-income consumer working 2 jobs and you're a parent, your time constraints are brutal. But if you're an unemployed person who wants to be working, but your reason for having fallen into poverty is being involuntarily unemployed, you actually have more time constraints, more time than you want. What you really want is a good job to get some money. And so I think that we need to think about that time constraint problem for particular households. There's also estimates of how long does it take to cook. You know, they might make a little cookbook and then add up all the times, but nobody really cooks like that. Everybody who's time constrained cooks a real meal once every 3 days, saves some of the food for the second night, you know. So I think the way people actually in practice cook takes less time than some of the estimates. The third is about taxes. And Juan Carlos knows that I've got an interest in how taxes, health-oriented taxes, land differently on people in different population groups, including differences by income. This is a big part of the debate, is whenever you propose a tax, people say, will this be harmful to lower income consumers? But of course, the health costs are also painful for low income consumers. It's not just the tax costs, it's the savings from healthier eating also land on lower income consumers. And so when you start to think about that, it's easier to see justification for some of these public health nutrition policies.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Hi, thank you, Park, for your presentation. It was really interesting. My name is Carolina Batis. I'm also a researcher here at INSP. And well, as Simon was telling you about this study that we conducted, what we did was kind of that optimization, but only for food groups and nutrients. And then we compared the cost. So we didn't ask for the cheapest diet, but we didn't mess with the price. We just calculated after the price to compare the cost of baskets that follow the healthy dietary guidelines or the current intake of the population. And then we also did with the Eat Lancet, like the sustainable and healthy diet. And as Simon was saying, what we found was that the current intake is more expensive than the others. Comparing with the healthy diet, it was very close, not as different. So as you said with the quadrant, we can find very, each quadrant full of kind of diets, no? Because there is a great overlap between price and diet quality. But then with the healthy and sustainable, then the gap is larger and is much cheaper because you decrease the amount of meat. So that is an expensive item. So I think it's very interesting also this kind of studies, because sometimes what they do is just compare or calculate the price of a healthy diet and see how affordable it is. And I like this approach of comparing to what people is actually eating. And one question that I have for you is about this thrifty food plan. I understand that the idea is that with this, they will base the amount that they will support the families. But do they have other strategies so that they adhere as much as possible to this thrifty plan, or it's just they can spend that money in anything, or how do they try to get people to eat as the diet that was kind of estimated? And also, I don't want to put Ale on the spot, but I will, because Ale, she's doing her PhD and she's looking at food insecurity and ultra-processed foods here in Mexico and in the US. And she's finding very interesting associations because it depends on the food. The association is in one way or the other. So I will put her on the spot.
Thanks for these comments and questions. So for the comments, of course, you can just imagine what a pleasure it is for me to be here, just because I'm learning a lot. And I should have known half of this already, but I'm learning more and more about similarities between some of the issues in Mexico and in the United States on cost of healthy food. And so I totally agree that what you're finding in some of the research from this institute is similar to this perspective that not all healthy food is expensive in the United States. And for the question, how does the federal nutrition assistance programs encourage healthy diets? In the SNAP program, it's not very didactic. So the SNAP program has a large nutrition education component, but the nutrition education is voluntary. And so, and they encourage as much healthy eating as possible, but they don't tell people that the food that you buy in the grocery store has to be healthy food. And they do forbid cigarettes and they forbid alcohol, but they permit even sugar sweetened beverages, and snack food is permitted with the SNAP benefits. There's other federal nutrition assistance programs like WIC, the Special Program for Women, Infant, and Children. That's more directive. It says you get this much tuna, this much whole grain bread, this much dairy. And so there you have to take the package that gets prescribed for you. Sometimes colleagues in public health nutrition say, let's make SNAP more like WIC. That's the advice. It's a slogan almost in the United States. But I have, as an economist who studies food, a little bit of a misgiving about straying that far from people's preferences. The WIC program is a smaller program, and it's not as closely connected to anti-hunger purposes. And so if our goals are simultaneously to support good nutrition and anti-hunger goals, then I'm nervous about making SNAP more like WIC. I kind of prefer let WIC be WIC and let SNAP be SNAP would almost be my slogan. But I understand that views may differ.
Thank you very much, Park, for your presentation. I'm Michelle, we met yesterday. And one of the questions that I have, it's about the definition of healthy diet, because I think that differences in the cost of healthy diet depends on the constraints and the definition of healthy diet. When we used the healthy eating index to define healthy diets in Mexico, we found mixed results. We found that healthy diets in rural areas are cost the same as the observed diets, and in urban there is mixed results. On average, they are more costly, but you can have a healthy diet with the same cost as the observed diet. But when things are changed, when we define a healthy diet with the new planetary diet that has less red meat and animal products and less ultra-processed products, it's the same that Carolina used, we found that here in Mexico, this type of healthy diet is less costly. And maybe I was wondering, what are the type of constraints that the Thrifty Food Plan uses? Because maybe there's a lot of red meat or milk, and you also said that the ultra-processed foods are also allowed. So what do you think about these constraints? Could it be changed? And also, is there a possibility to include other constraints like reducing greenhouse gas emissions, water use, like the Food and Agriculture Organization is doing with its optimization model? They are also including these planetary limits. So that's all. Thank you.
That's great. So for the first question is, I have to decide how blunt spoken to be, but I do feel, I'm going to go ahead and say it. I feel that the nutrient constraints have the strongest science justification. Some of the broad food constraints, broad food group constraints, have the second strongest science justification, like having dairy or having enough fruits and vegetables or having enough food from the protein category. The more questionable part is particular meats within the protein category, because even the protein category has good plant sources of protein. And even within the animal protein categories, chicken comes out as more desirable, as a good source of less expensive, high nutrient density food, more so than beef, and pork is in the middle. And so the diet would not have any beef in it, I think, if they did not add extra practicality constraints. And so then there's these extra, and the term is practicality constraints, but it bumps up the beef. not to a very high level, but I think it gives a sense that there ought to be a distribution by protein category if the diet is being promoted by USDA. The second thing is I totally connect with your interest in healthy and sustainable diets. And I think some of you know, this is something that's not just a casual topic for me, but a heartfelt sense of connection to the crisis of our time in the climate crisis. I'm here in Mexico doing an experiment in low carbon academic life, having traveled here by train and bus from Boston, and I will go back over the course of the next few days. Even though it seems crazy, just in order to see what's possible. And so I think about that in my own personal life, but I also think about it in my professional interest in healthy and sustainable diets. And so I sort of take you as a little bit of in the optimist category, roughly, that just being sustainable and just being healthy does not necessarily make the food more expensive. Yeah.
Lili y luego Ale.
Okay. Hi, I just want to hear more about the approaches that you might have thought of. Just adding to what Simon was saying at the beginning. So now you have more budget to give within the SNAP program, right? What if people use this money and still buy the same thing because their preferences are based from a long time of eating the same things? So they have more money to buy that. And so they have now extra money from their own pocket to do more things, good or bad, no? So, but then now you're giving them more budget. That's a real scenario and a real possibility. So there must be approaches to sort of deal with that, right? So I'm just curious about that, because I think that's the problem with generally all cash transfers. We worry about that. That was my question.
Exactly. So in some ways, in the earlier question and answer, we started this conversation about what are the options. So let's continue the response on that. One of the possibilities is to have the SNAP benefit restrict which foods. And the part that I'm most open to is the sugar sweetened beverages, because even snack food has more nutrients in it and is more closely connected with cultural traditions. Whereas sugar sweetened beverages that are fairly inexpensive, people can buy it with their cash income. There's no real reason, in my view, necessarily why the government ought to be supporting purchases of sugar sweetened beverages. But it's controversial in the US. There's many politically progressive public health nutrition colleagues who don't even prefer to restrict SNAP benefits in any way because they want to preserve the anti-hunger goals. I think that you could do a study of a SNAP benefit in a particular area without sugar sweetened beverage being permitted and investigate whether it's reasonably popular. And I have a hypothesis that even for many SNAP consumers, they might actually like that, because it's one thing to say, oh, you're restricting my choices, that's bad. But if you're a parent and your own kids are pestering you for more sugar sweetened beverages, it's useful to be able to say, no, that's not permitted with this card. Next month, as a treat, you can have a sugar sweetened beverage, but right now I'm buying our weekly groceries and it's not permitted to have the sugar sweetened beverages. To me, it's easy to imagine that that could actually be useful for many consumers. And it's an empirical question. Is that the case? But the other thing is, I think that my colleagues in public health nutrition in the United States would be on stronger ground with SNAP policy that was more nutrition oriented if they also have the courage to speak up boldly for public health nutrition policies that affect middle income people and high income people also. So it doesn't seem like we're just telling the low income people what they ought to be eating. And so Mexico is, of course, to me, to some extent, an aspiration, because you have the warning labels on the ultra processed foods. You have a sugar sweetened beverage tax that affects people at all income levels. And so neither of these do we have in the United States.
Hola, bueno, voy a hablar en español. Yo soy Alejandra y soy estudiante del doctorado y, como dijo Caro, trabajo el tema de la asociación entre inseguridad alimentaria y consumo de alimentos ultraprocesados en México y en Estados Unidos. Y justo haciendo el análisis de mis datos, veíamos, estamos dividiendo como por subgrupos y veíamos que justo hay en algunos grupos donde se comporta de manera similar, que a mayor inseguridad alimentaria consumen, por ejemplo, bebidas azucaradas u otros alimentos, pero sí hay grandes diferencias, sobre todo en la cantidad también de variedad y que existe con los datos de Keynes en Estados Unidos. Y, por ejemplo, veíamos el consumo de pizza en Estados Unidos, que a mayor inseguridad alimentaria también aumentaba el consumo, ¿no? Entonces, veíamos como estas diferencias que hay en México y en Estados Unidos. Y también quería preguntar si estas diferencias, además de la cantidad o variedad que existe en alimentos ultraprocesados en Estados Unidos, los costos también podrían estar relacionados justo como cómo se mide la inseguridad alimentaria en México y en Estados Unidos. Si bien la escala que se usa en México está basada en la de Estados Unidos y es similar, hay algunas preguntas que son diferentes y, por ejemplo, una que me llama mucho la atención es que en Estados Unidos se sigue preguntando si hay una pérdida de peso y en México esa pregunta no existe. Y justo, bueno, me han comentado que también es una pregunta que podría justo no reflejar como la inseguridad alimentaria, ¿no? Porque hay también muchos estudios que indican que a mayor inseguridad alimentaria, mayor obesidad. Entonces, bueno, nada más. Sí.
Yeah. So that particular question about losing weight is not the way anybody would have written that question if this food security supplement were being designed today. And I think it's just as well to hear that Mexico, it doesn't use it in your own food security scale. There's no obligation to use it. I think it would have been removed long ago from the US scale if it caused much harm to the estimates, but it turns out not to cause much harm to the estimates because it's not all that frequently affirmed anyway. And so I think my colleagues at USDA would long ago have corrected that question, except that I think they find it didn't matter one way or the other. And so they end up just leaving it in order to have a consistent instrument from year after year. But I think that you can tell that I'm not enormously enamored with the scaling statistics, but the one thing they are most useful for is for diagnosing if you change a question or drop a question or rotate out a question for another question, how much difference does it make in your estimates? Then those statistical tools actually are kind of useful for that purpose. So if you ever want to know if the US and Mexico have several of the same questions, but some of the different questions, then it might be worth a little study of those item response theory models, just because they can help you understand how much difference did it make, which questions were included or excluded. Yeah.
Gracias.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. My name is Caroline. I studied my master's degree here, but I'm from the United States. It's actually a follow-up picking on the same topic Ali just asked. I'm curious if you can orient us a bit in what exactly is the basis of the information, the main characteristics of the core instrument used by the USDA to study food security in the United States, with some core characteristics. For example, how many items are there? Are they yes or no, or are they gradient scale? Are they the same for adults and for adolescents or youth, for example, as some of the components? And what is the period of reference used? And how could that compare in grand scale in your experience to some of the larger scales, some of them more recently updated, such as the FIES, the Food and Security Experience Scale by the FAO, and the ELCSA?
Great. So originally the work that underlay U.S. household food security measurement included parallel work that was being done by several research teams. One of them was at Cornell University. One of them was at the Anti-Hunger Organization, the Food Research and Action Center. And each of them had been developing questions, and then they collaborated. They had a series of high-profile meetings and ended up selecting these 18 items that are in the current official scale. For the 18 items, 10 are asked of all households and 8 reference children in the household, such as did the children cut or skip meals because of not having enough money. And they dropped some items about coping strategies because it did not do well with the scaling statistics. And so this, you could see how this is what touches upon my prejudices, which is, I think that makes the scaling methods too influential. I think we should ask the questions we want to ask without worrying quite so much about the scaling properties. But that's my view. The different instruments for different households. Currently, the only difference that's asked in the official scale is between households with and without children. So I have a particular interest in whether there's differential item response, this diff, for households with and without children. And this is something I've studied over the years. I think I'm not all that persuasive that it's an interesting question. To me, it seems interesting because you're asking different questions of the different households. So you need to know how people answer across that demographic group in particular. You know, you've got SNAP participants, non-SNAP participants, low-income people, high-income people. All of them get asked the same questions, but households with and without children get asked different questions. There's strengths and weaknesses to having survey questions exactly match particular people in their cultural context. So one of the small grants that we gave out as part of this 25-year anniversary of the food security measurement was for indigenous households in the United States. Another one was for Latino and Latina households in the United States. And so though the implied solution, if there's differences, would be maybe you ask different questions for different households. But if you ask different questions for different households, you have difficulty coming up with an authoritative national estimate. And an authoritative national estimate is in its own way an important thing to calculate. And so I don't have a solution. There's the trade-off. You can either match individual communities and their context, or you can have an authoritative national estimate, but it's hard to do both at the same time.
¿Tenemos alguna otra pregunta o comentario? Sí, ahorita pasamos al chat. Si quieres,
My name is Hallie. I'm also from the US, studying my master's degree here. And I'm just a little curious how you determined like the preferences of the people, because like through my thought process, I think proximity of like stores that are in the area and acceptability of the products that are carried in the stores may also determine perceived preferences. Because like if the products aren't acceptable to the people, they may keep buying other stuff that aren't necessarily their preferences. So I'm just a little curious about that.
So USDA is doing something very nice. They currently have a request for proposals in the field, asking researchers to propose a project that would help ground truth the Thrifty Food Plan. Because the Thrifty Food Plan doesn't take into good account some of the things that you raise. And so the idea is the Thrifty Food Plan doesn't take into account different food retail access in different neighborhoods, different prices for different size retailers. Instead, it uses national average prices. And so what this new project would do is it would ground truth the Thrifty Food Plan by having researchers make a menu and a shopping list that corresponds to the Thrifty Food Plan, and then go try it out in different retailers in different neighborhoods, including urban, suburban, and rural neighborhoods. And so I could just hear from your question that some of that is going to interest you almost more than the national average data.
Tenemos unas preguntas ¿en qué? En las redes, ¿sí? No sé quién las podría leer. ¿Quién? ¿Sí? ¿Quién? Ah, Regina. Mariana.
The first one is, how are these thrifty policy with crash against the money gaining in the public norms?
Oh, the money gaining, say the last part.
Money gaining and the public norms.
Oh, how well do they match people's public norms and how much money they have?
Yes.
And so the Thrifty Food Plan takes strong account of the budget constraint. You can see that that's central. And the norms, there's like several of your questions make me feel a little pressure. Because Juan Carlos asked about, you know, what all is in the utility function, and others asked, does it take account of food retail access or neighborhood differences? It's fairly simple. It really is just minimizing the difference. It's like a quadratic difference. It's like let me just say another word about how that works. For each food category, you see how much different did they get for that food category, like bananas. How much different is the model diet, the Thrifty Food Plan diet, from how much bananas people actually consume on average? And then you take that difference, that's the contribution of bananas to the total difference. And then you add up the contribution for the bananas and the apples and the beef and the pasta, and you get what is the total difference between the model diet and people's current consumption. And so that's the theory behind the Thrifty Food Plan. And if you find that imperfect, there are many other traditions for you. One is, if you're an economist, or maybe this conversation is going to make you want to become an economist, then you could think about a utility model that has people's preferences more as the objective. Or if you are really interested in local context, you might have to sacrifice the optimization. You might say to yourself, that's kind of nice, but I don't really trust optimization models. All I want to do is just see how are people in different communities thriving. And so for that, there is excellent research traditions, including both quantitative and qualitative research, but then you would not have the optimization. You would probably do it without constrained optimization modeling. Yeah.
Muy bien. ¿Tienen alguna? Yo creo que ya estamos por terminar. Si hubiera alguna otra pregunta, podríamos tomarla, y si no, ya estamos, ¿verdad? ¿Sí? Ok. No, pues muchísimas gracias, Park. Yo creo que fue un seminario muy valioso. Hay todo un interés en el grupo, como puedes ver, en estos temas. El instituto tiene muchos años estudiando componentes de la seguridad alimentaria, y últimamente estamos muy interesados en los aspectos de sostenibilidad, de la dieta saludable. Acaban de salir nuestras guías alimentarias, y estamos pues también en una discusión pública de si podemos recomendar dietas más saludables o no. Y una de las narrativas es que pues las dietas saludables son muy caras, y entonces que la gente tiene que comer chatarra, y nosotros pues tenemos ese discurso optimista de que por supuesto que podemos dejar de comer la chatarra. Y tenemos esos dos sombreros, el de entenderlo a nivel de investigación, y también el de salud pública, de no queremos promover la comida chatarra. Entonces, bueno, yo creo que nos diste un panorama muy interesante de las metodologías, y pues muchos de aquí yo creo que te van a estar leyendo en los próximos meses para sus trabajos. Muchísimas gracias por venir a este seminario, y pues despidamos al doctor Park White con un fuerte aplauso. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.